more than 2.5 centuries, they were Europe's ghost empire. A complete whirlwind of steppe cavalry that just exploded out of the east, carved out a massive empire, a Khaganate, right in the heart of the continent, and then, poof, they vanished, leaving behind little more than legends and some seriously impressive treasure. They were the Avars. And today, we're going to be historical detectives. We're piecing together all the clues, from ancient texts, archaeology, and even brand new DNA evidence, to finally unmask this forgotten superpower.
All right, let's just jump right in. The central mystery here is actually pretty simple, but it's one that's stumped historians for ages. Who were these people? I mean, they dominated a huge chunk of Europe from the 6th to the 8th century. They literally shaped the map of the early medieval world and decided the fates of giants like the Byzantine and Frankish empires. But for all that, their true identity has been this huge, nagging question mark.
So our investigation has to start at the very beginning, with the biggest clue of all. Where did they come from? To figure out who the Avars really were, we have to sift through these totally conflicting stories that were being told at the time, stories that created a mystery that would last for over 1,400 years.
Okay, so on one side, you have what the Avars themselves said. When they showed up in Europe, they claimed to be the direct heirs of the mighty Avar Khaganate, this massive empire from the Mongolian steppe that had just been crushed by a rival power called the Gökturks. Now that was a huge claim. It gave them instant legitimacy. But on the other side, you have the Gökturks, their mortal enemies. They sent messengers to Constantinople basically saying, don't listen to those guys, they're fakes, pseudo-Avars. They claimed they were just a bunch of random tribes who stole a famous name to scare everybody. And for centuries, that's where the debate stood. Who was telling the truth?
And then, just in 2022, modern science dropped an absolute bombshell. A landmark genetic study analyzed the actual remains of the Avar ruling class, and their DNA told a story that was just incredible. It pointed to a super fast, long-distance migration, all the way across the Eurasian continent. And this right here is the smoking gun. The genetic profile of the earliest, highest-ranking Avar leaders buried in Europe was a near-perfect match for ancient DNA found way over in Mongolia, right in the heart of the old Roman Empire. The science is undeniable. The Avar leadership really did come from the East Asian steppe. They weren't imposters at all. They were the real deal. Okay, so we've got a lock on their identity. Let's move to the next part of our investigation. How did this group of people, after trekking thousands of miles, build such a dominant empire so incredibly quickly? Well, the answer lies in their military machine, this revolutionary way of war that was perfected over centuries on the steppe. At the heart of Avar power was their heavy cavalry, and man, were they deadly. They had these tactics that European armies just had no answer for. Their classic move was the feigned retreat. So they'd pretend to run away, baiting their enemies into a chaotic, disorganized chase. Then, like it was perfectly choreographed, they would turn in their saddles and unleash a storm of arrows from these ridiculously powerful composite bows. We're talking arrows that could punch through armor from 200 meters away. And once the enemy was confused and their formation was shattered, the Avars would wheel around and slam into them with the final crushing charge of lances and swords. Game over. And it wasn't just about being tough warriors. These guys were rich, and they wanted you to know it. Archaeologists have found graves just stuffed with treasures, like these beautiful gilt bronze mounts. Their weapons, their armor, their horse gear, it wasn't just functional, it was art. It was a symbol of power for a warrior class that saw war itself as a kind of masterpiece.
So, at the absolute peak of their power, the Avars decided to go for the ultimate prize. They launched their most ambitious attack ever, a joint siege of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, alongside their allies, the Sassanid Persians. This was it, the ultimate test of their power, an attempt to conquer the greatest city in the Christian world.
But the great city didn't fall, and their failure really boiled down to one huge weakness. They had no navy. See, the Persians were on the Asian side of the water, the Avars were on the European side, and the Byzantine fleet owned the sea in between. They couldn't link up. The city's massive walls were just too much for them. And in one last, desperate gamble, their fleet of Slavic canoes got lured into a trap and was completely wiped out. The defeat was a huge blow to Avar prestige, a real turning point for their empire.
You know, empires aren't just won on the battlefield. So let's look at the next clue and see how the Avars played the game of geopolitics. Because their real power didn't just come from fighting, it came from some very shrewd politics and, let's be honest, a mastery of extortion.
The sheer scale of the Avar enterprise is just mind-boggling. Let this number sink in for a second. 6 million solati. That's the estimated amount of gold the Byzantine Empire paid to the Avars in tribute between 574 and 626. That is an unbelievable fortune. It was literally a river of gold flowing from the richest empire in the world straight into the Avar treasury. Seriously, the Avars were running what was probably the most successful protection racket in history. They demanded land and massive payments from the Byzantines in exchange for not attacking them and for, managing all the other tribes on the border. In doing that, they also became a huge catalyst for the great Slavic migrations into the Balkans, which permanently changed the ethnic map of Europe. And at the same time, they were going head-to-head with the rising power of the Franks in the West, fighting for total control of Central Europe. Okay, so they had the military muscle, they had the political savvy, but how did they pay for it all? How did they sustain this empire on the ground? Let's dig into the evidence from their economy to see what held this whole thing together. So the Avars arrived as pure steppe nomads, but they were smart enough to adapt. In their new home, the super fertile Carpathian Basin, they slowly shifted to a more settled way of life. Raising animals was still key, of course, but they also started building settlements and, more importantly, controlling strategic resources. They took over the region's salt trade, and you have to remember, back then, salt was basically like oil is for us today. It gave them another massive economic lever to control everyone around them. But as we all know, every great power eventually falls. Every empire has an end date. So for our final chapter, we're going to assemble the last few clues that explain how this incredible empire, after 250 years of dominance, just completely collapsed and was wiped off the map. And the end, when it came, was shockingly fast. It was like a perfect storm of problems hitting all at once. It really kicks off in 791, when the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne launched his first huge campaigns against them. That outside pressure sparked a bloody civil war among the Avars themselves in 795, which killed off their top leaders. A year later, the Franks captured the Ring, the legendary Avar treasure. Now, weakened and divided, they get hit from the east by the rising power of the Bulgars. It was a war on two fronts they just couldn't win. The Avars literally found themselves caught in a pressure cooker. You had Charlemagne's Franks just hammering them relentlessly from the west, pushing deeper and deeper into their homeland. And at the exact same time, Khan Krum's Bulgars were pressing in from the east. Caught between these two expanding empires and torn apart by their own internal fighting, the Avar Khaganate was just systematically dismantled. But here's the really fascinating part. While the Avar state was completely destroyed, the Avar people didn't just disappear into thin air. The same genetic studies that proved where they came from also show that over time, their DNA mixed into the local populations they had ruled. So the empire became a ghost, yeah, but their descendants were absorbed into the people who would become modern-day Hungarians and their neighbors, leaving this faint but permanent genetic echo right in the heart of Europe. This story of the Avars is just such a powerful example of how modern science can reach back in time and solve ancient mysteries, turning a ghost empire into a real, tangible part of our history. And it just makes you wonder, right? What other secrets, what other lost links in the human story are just buried out there, waiting for the right piece of tech to finally bring them to light?
Hey, if you enjoyed digging into this historical mystery with us, please help us unearth more stories by hitting that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bells so you don't miss our next investigation.
And as always, the absolute best thing you can do to help the channel grow is to share this explainer with someone you think would find it interesting. Thanks so much for watching.